So I'll say again, I am not a super EEVEE expert, and that is because I don't, for the type of work I'm typically doing and the amount of work that's going into any one project, it's just hard for me to justify rendering something in EEVEE when Cycles is almost always going to give me more realistic, better results. That being said, for pre-visualization work, or maybe the client budget is really low and you just can't even afford to tie your computer up rendering, or if you're rendering on a cloud service and you don't want to spend the money on it, EEVEE is an option. I still play with EEVEE sometimes, and it's nice, but it works a lot more like a game engine. So let's go ahead and switch our render engine to EEVEE, and that'll calculate. And you can see right off the bat, we have a pretty decent, looking thing. It's obviously much faster. We're looking at this all in real time, basically. There's no sampling. So that's all very impressive. And you see the lighting still looks pretty darn good. We do have some issues, of course, with the glass materials. And this would be a particular case where I would probably recommend against EEVEE. Just anytime you've got glass or something like that, it's just not going to look as good as it does in Cycles. But you can see this is behaving as if it was kind of just a diffuse material with a lot of glossiness, and it works pretty fine. And honestly, that's, if I was rendering red wine in particular, I probably would just leave this black and not even try to make it transparent. But so that we can go through some of the settings, what I'm going to do is change this to a clear material. So I'm going to turn the value all the way up, and then I'm going to drop the saturation so that we have just a pure white for the material here. Now with EEVEE, we have to go into the material settings, and the first one you're going to want to change is this blend mode. You can use alpha hashed, which sometimes gives you better results, but I think alpha blend tends to just be kind of faster and smoother. But you're noticing that nothing's working. We can't see through this bottle, and that's because with EEVEE, we're actually going to need to bring this alpha down if we want to see through this material. So you can bring this down pretty low for something like a clear bottle like this, something like 0.15. And what that's doing is just making it transparent, basically. So you can see with the alpha hashed, when we render this, we'd have more samples, so it might not be so grainy, but you do introduce a little bit of graininess using that alpha hashed. So what I like to use is actually the alpha blend option. And then again, it just depends on your materials, your scene, but you may want to leave the shadows as opaque, or oftentimes I'll just turn them off for glass materials. But again, EEVEE, not necessarily the best for something like this. So I'll leave the shadows as opaque, and then maybe I'll just turn them off because I think that's what I would normally do. And then you can turn on screen space refraction. And then I think since there's no subsurface on this material, the subsurface translucency is not going to do much for us. But for the screen space refraction, you need to turn that up just a little bit, and then you'll start to see the effect. And this has something to do with the thickness of the object. Let me go ahead and get the wine material set up though inside here. For that, let's just make it kind of like a rosé material maybe. And we can similarly turn the shadows off and turn the blend mode to alpha blend, and we'll start to be able to see through that. So we do have some kind of not fun things happening with the way that those are intersecting. We've got some weird kind of shading there, but I think what we need to do is similarly go down here and turn the alpha value down a little bit so that you can see through it. And we're still getting some bad reflections there. I can't remember exactly. Screen space refraction, shadow mode, opaque. I forget what turns that off. Show backface. So show backface is it's gonna hide what's in the background, which can sometimes help. It looks like that's actually doing quite a bit for us in terms of the being able to see it a little bit more accurately. Let's turn so we've got our alpha down a little bit. We could turn it down maybe even more. Maybe this gets darker, less saturation. I'm not sure. The example here, though, it just works a little bit better when it's not so dark. You can kind of see what's happening better. So we're getting some weird behavior with our label, and the reason for that is, if you remember, we used a PNG image, and when you bring that in, it actually will detect that it's a PNG, and it will automatically set the setting here to alpha blend. So since this is just opaque, we can actually turn that back to opaque. So that's a product of importing it as a PNG. That can be a little confusing. Sometimes if you're getting just some very odd shading behavior with a material that should be pretty normal. A lot of times that could be what it is that this is set to something other than opaque when all it needs to be is opaque. Now the next thing I'll do, the bump settings in EEVEE tend to be a little bit overblown, so I would want to turn the bump strength back quite a bit. Something like that looks fine. And this is still looks really nice given how fast this is rendering. So, don't be afraid to still use the bump, but you may just want to turn it back a little bit. You can see how that's looking. So next big thing would be some contact shadow. So it does appear that our wine bottle is floating a little bit, but you can see that it is actually on the plane. If we were to just drag this up ever so slightly, you can see that is sitting on the plane, but it's looking like it's floating. And that's because we're missing contact shadow. So what you want to do for that is go into each of your lamps, and then you can check on this setting for contact shadows. There's some more settings that you can mess with here to get the look right. But for this, I'm just going to leave them all at default and just turn on contact shadows. And now you can see that we've created a little bit of contact basically between the bottle itself and the floor. So I think that's about it for the settings. You might also want to go into the screen space reflections and turn on refraction, which is going to do, I think that might be creating some of these lighting effects, but it just it'll help. Maybe that's what the issue was with the wine, actually, was the refraction thing. Let's try to get that wine selected and see if we go back. We're just doing a little bit of experimenting here, and I encourage you to do the same. Let's turn back on back face. And then, okay, so that's not what that is. So let's go back and turn off the back face. Once again, I will emphasize, I do not recommend using EEVEE here, but I know, just computer limitations, especially if you're running an animation, you just want to get this thing rendered, not wait for cycles, then it's okay to use EEVEE. And just want to show you what some of those settings would be. So we're in pretty good shape there. In terms of rendering with EEVEE, it renders crazy fast. You can see if it's only at 64, it's done just like that. And honestly, that's not a horrible looking render, especially if you're doing an animation. This is obviously going to be much faster, but for me, I would highly recommend using cycles. It's just going to look a little bit better. Now EEVEE does have the advantage of things like bloom, where you can get this kind of nice blooming, glowy effect. Everybody loves that with EEVEE. You can reproduce that in cycles in the compositor, but in EEVEE it comes right out of the box. So that's kind of a cool thing. Only other thing I might mess with is, what else could we mess with to make EEVEE better? There are, it doesn't make as much sense if there's just one object, but if there's multiple objects, you need to show them reflecting off of each other. You might want to add in a reflection cube map. And then there's also this irradiance volume, which will sample the lighting from around the scene. And for that, I'm pretty sure you can just scale it until it's about the size you need. And what that's going to do, I believe, is take samples from all those little dots there and kind of sample the light in those different areas so that it can get a feel for like what's in the environment. And you might actually want to make that much bigger depending on kind of where your objects are in the scene. And there are some samples for that. You can turn up the resolution of it slightly if you'd like to. And then to get that working, you would go down here into indirect lighting, and then you can bake the indirect lighting. And you'll see here on the bottom that it's gonna bake it. And what that does is it's just gonna add some. It'll add more light to your scene. You can see like the label, for example, got a lot brighter, and I think that's because it's pulling maybe some of the light from this big reflector wall we have. Let's see, if we delete that lighting cache, you can see it gets a little bit darker. So if you do really want to crank your EEVEE settings, then you can do things like that, but I would advise you to look maybe more into it. But my real advice would be to use cycles, but just didn't want to leave you hanging. So that's about it for rendering in EEVEE that I'm going to cover. If anyone has any particularly good advice to go along with that, feel free to share it. But those are just some kind of quick tips to transition the scene from a cycles render, which is what we set up initially, to EEVEE. Not a ton of stuff to do, but a couple things to note. And yeah, with that you can render an EEVEE. So that's going to be it for this section of the tutorial. We're going to leave it at that. And what I'm going to do now is try to come up with some cool little animations we could do for people looking to take this project to the next level and just kind of increase the presentation value a little bit more than you'd have with just a single still render. So thanks for being here. Like and subscribe, or if you're not teachable, I don't know what you do. Maybe there's got to be some big cool red button somewhere. I'm not sure, but thanks for being here. Really appreciate it, and I'll see you around.